Coming at you live from the beautiful heartland of these good old United States of America, right at the confluence of the mighty Mississippi and the majestic Missouri rivers, St. Charles, Missouri. This is The Rant. I'm your host, Charles Lamson. Today is Sunday, 3rd day of November, year of our Lord 2019. Today's topic, going to be doing more financial review stuff. First half of the show, well, it's going to be economics and financial stuff. First half of the show, I'm going to be bringing back the spirit of Alfred Marshall, and he's going to be talking about his principles of economics in a seance. And then, so while I'm doing that, I'm going to be doing a motivational, inspirational, fitness instructional video. Going to be doing that the first half of the show. Then I'm going to close the seance, do a banishing ritual. I'm going to send Alfred Marshall's spirit back to hell where he belongs. And then we're going to talk about timely news story, timely top stories in the world of finance. So you got that to look forward to, ladies and gentlemen. All right. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Alfred, are you there? Hello. Hello, Alfred.
Appendix A, Sections 1 through 8 of Principles of Economics. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Principles of Economics by Alfred Marshall. Appendix A, Sections 1 through 8. The growth of free industry and enterprise. Section 1. The last section of the first chapter of Book 1 describes the purpose of Appendices A and B, and may be taken as an introduction to them. Although the proximate causes of the chief events in history are to be found in the actions of individuals, yet most of the conditions which have made these events possible are traceable to the influence of inherited institutions and race qualities and of physical nature. Race qualities themselves are, however, mainly caused by the action of individuals and physical causes in more or less remote times. A strong race has often sprung, in fact as well as in name, from the progenitor of singular strength of body and character. The usage which makes a race strong in peace and war are often due to the wisdom of a few great thinkers, who have interpreted and developed its customs and rules, perhaps by formal precepts, perhaps by a quiet and almost unperceived influence. But none of these things are of any permanent avail if the climate is unfavorable to vigor. The gifts of nature, her land, her waters, and her skies determine the character of the race's work, and thus give a tone to social and political institutions. These differences do not show themselves clearly so long as man is still savage. Scanty and untrustworthy as is our information about the habits of savage tribes, we know enough of them to be sure that they show a strange uniformity of general character amid great variety of detail. Whatever be their climate and whatever their ancestry, we find savages living under the dominion of custom and impulse, scarcely ever striking out new lines for themselves, never forecasting the distant future, and seldom making provision even for the near future, fitful in spite of their servitude to custom, governed by the fancy of the moment, ready at times for the most arduous exertions, but incapable of keeping themselves long to steady work. Laborious and tedious tasks are avoided as far as possible. Those which are inevitable are done by the compulsory labor of women. It is when we pass from savage life to the early forms of civilization that the influence of physical surroundings forces itself most on our notice. This is partly because early history is meager and tells us but little of the particular events and of the influences of strong individual characters by which the course of national progress has been guided and controlled, hastened onwards, or turned backwards. But it is chiefly because in this stage of his progress, man's power of contending with nature is small, and he could do nothing without her generous help. Nature has marked out a few places on the earth's surface as specially favorable to man's first attempts to raise himself from the savage state, and the first growth of culture and the industrial arts was directed and controlled by the physical conditions of these favored spots. Even the simplest civilization is impossible unless man's efforts are more than sufficient to supply him with the necessaries of life. Some surplus over them is required to support that mental effort in which progress takes its rise, and therefore nearly all early civilizations have been in warm climates where the necessaries of life are small, and where nature makes bountiful returns even to the rudest cultivation. They have often gathered around a great river which has lent moisture to the soil and afforded an easy means of communication. The rulers have generally belonged to a race that has recently come from a cooler climate in a distant country or in neighboring mountain lands. For a warm climate is destructive of energy, and the force which enabled them to rule has almost in every case been the product of the more temperate climate of their early homes. They have indeed retained much of their energy in their new homes for several generations, living meanwhile in luxury on the surplus products of the labor of the subject races, and have found scope for their abilities in the work of rulers, warriors, and priests. Originally ignorant, they have quickly learned all that their subjects had to teach, and have gone beyond them. But in this stage of civilization, an enterprising intellectual character has almost always been confined to the ruling few. It has scarcely ever been found in those who have borne the main burden of industry. The reason of this is that the climate which has rendered an early civilization possible has also doomed it to weakness. In colder climates, nature provides an invigorating atmosphere, and though man has a hard struggle at first, yet as his knowledge and riches increase, he is able to gain plentiful food and warm clothing, and at a later stage he provides himself with those large and substantial buildings which are the most expensive requisites of a cultured life in places in which the severity of the weather makes it necessary that nearly all domestic services and meetings for social intercourse should have the protection of a roof. But the fresh, invigorating air which is necessary to the fullness of life cannot be obtained at all when nature does not freely give it. The laborer may indeed be found doing hard physical work under a tropical sun. The handicraftsman may have artistic instincts. The sage, the statesman, or the banker may be acute and subtle. But high temperature makes hard and sustained physical work inconsistent with a high intellectual activity. Under the combined influence of climate and luxury, the ruling class gradually lose their strength. Fewer and fewer of them are capable of great things, and at last they are overthrown by a stronger race, which has come most probably from a cooler climate. Sometimes they form an intermediate caste between those whom have hitherto ruled and their new rulers, but more often they sink down among the spiritless mass of the people. Such a civilization has often much that is interesting to the philosophical historian. Its whole life is pervaded almost unconsciously by a few simple ideas which are interwoven in that pleasant harmony that gives their charm to oriental carpets. There is much to be learnt from tracing these ideas to their origin in the combined influence of race, of physical surroundings, of religion, philosophy, and poetry, of the incidents of warfare, and of the dominating influence of strong individual characters. All this is instructive to the economist in many ways, but it does not throw a very direct light on the motives, which it is his special province to study. For in such a civilization, the ablest men look down on work. There are no bold, free, enterprising workmen, and no adventurous capitalists. Despised industry is regulated by custom, and even looks to custom as its sole protector from arbitrary tyranny. The greater part of custom is doubtless but a crystallized form of oppression and suppression, but a body of custom which did nothing but grind down the weak could not long survive. For the strong rest on the support of the weak. Their own strength cannot sustain them without that support, and if they organize social arrangements which burden the weak wantonly and beyond measure, they thereby destroy themselves. Consequently, every body of custom that endures contains provisions that protect the weak from the most reckless forms of injury. In fact, when there is little enterprise and no scope for effective competition, custom is a necessary shield to defend people not only from others who are stronger than themselves, but even from their neighbors in the same rank of life. If the village smith can sell his plowshares to none but the village, and if the village can buy their shares from no one but him, it is to the interest of all that the price should be fixed at a moderate level by custom. By such means, custom earns sanctity, and there is nothing in the first steps of progress that tends to break down the primitive habit of regarding the innovator as impious and an enemy. Thus, the influence of economic causes is pressed below the surface, where they work surely and slowly. They take generations instead of years to produce their effect. Their action is so subtle as easily to escape observation altogether, and they can indeed hardly be traced except by those who have learnt where to look for them by watching the more conspicuous and rapid workings of similar causes in modern times. Section 2. This force of custom in early civilizations is partly a cause and partly a consequence of the limitations of individual rights and property. As regards all property more or less, but especially as regards land, the rights of the individual are generally derived from and limited by, and in every way subordinate to, those of the household and the family in the narrower sense of the term. The rights of the household are in like manner subordinate to those of the village, which is often only an expanded and developed family, according to traditionary fiction, if not in fact. It is true that in an early stage of civilization, few would have had much desire to depart far from the practices that were prevalent around them. However complete and sharply defined had been the rights of individuals over their own property, they would have been unwilling to face the anger with which their neighbors would regard any innovation, and the ridicule which would be poured on anyone who should set himself up to be wiser than his ancestors. But many little changes would occur to the bolder spirits, and if they had been free to try experiments on their own account, changes might have grown by small and almost imperceptible stages until sufficient variation of practice had been established to blur the clear outline of customary regulations and to give considerable freedom to individual choice. When, however, each head of a household was regarded as only senior partner and trustee for the family property, the smallest divergence from ancestral routine met with the opposition of people who had a right to be consulted on every detail. And further in the background, behind the authoritative resistance of the family, was that of the village. For though each family had sole use for a time of its cultivated ground, yet many operations were generally conducted in common, so that each had to do the same things as the others at the same time. Each field, when its turn came to be fallow, became part of the common pasture land, and the whole land of the village was subject to redistribution from time to time. Therefore, the village had a clear right to prohibit any innovation, for it might interfere with their plans for the collective cultivation, and it might ultimately impair the value of the land and thus injure them when the time came for the next redistribution. In consequence, there often grew up a complex network of rules, by which every cultivator was so rigidly bound that he could not use his own judgment and discretion, even in the most trivial details. It is probable that this has been the most important of all the causes which have delayed the growth of the spirit of free enterprise among mankind. It may be noticed that the collective ownership of property was in harmony with that spirit of quietism which pervades many Eastern religions, and that its long survival among the Hindus has been partly due to the repose which is inculcated in their religious writings. It is probable that while the influence of custom over prices, wages, and rent has been overrated, its influence over the forms of production and the general economic arrangements of society has been underrated. In one case, its effects are obvious, but they are not cumulative, and in the other, they are not obvious, but they are cumulative. And it is an almost universal rule that when the effect of a cause, though small at any one time, are constantly working in the same direction, their influence is much greater than at first sight appears possible. But however great the influence of custom in early civilization, the spirit of Greeks and Romans was full of enterprise, and more interest attaches to the inquiry why they knew and cared so little for those social aspects of economic problems which are of so great interest to us. Section 3. The homes of most of the earlier civilizations had been in great river basins, whose well-watered plains were seldom visited by famine. For in a climate in which heat is never lacking, the fertility of the soil varies almost directly with its moisture. The rivers also offered means of easy communication that were favorable to simple forms of trade and division of labor, and did not hinder the movements of the large armies by which the despotic force of the central government was maintained. It is true that the Phoenicians lived on the sea. This great Semitic race did a good service by preparing the way for free intercourse among many peoples, and by spreading the knowledge of writing, of arithmetic, and of weights and measures. But they gave their chief energies to commerce and manufacture. It was left for the genial sympathies and the fresh spirit of the Greeks to breathe in the full breath of freedom over the sea, and to absorb into their own free lives the best thoughts and the highest art of the old world. Their numberless settlements in Asia Minor, Magna Graecia, and in the Hellas proper developed freely their own ideals under the influence of the new thoughts that burst upon them. Having constant intercourse with one another, as well as with those who held the keys of the older learning, sharing one another's experiences, but fettered by no authority. Energy and enterprise, instead of being repressed by the weight of traditional usage, were encouraged to found a new colony and work out new ideas without restraint. Their climate absolved them of the need of exhausting work. They left to their slaves what drudgery had to be done, and gave themselves up to the free play of their fancy. House, room, clothing, and firing cost but little. Their genial skies invited them to out-of-door life, making intercourse for social and political purposes easy and without expense. And yet the cool breezes of the Mediterranean so far refreshed their vigor that they did not for many generations lose the spring and elasticity of temper which they had brought from their homes in the north. Under these conditions were matured a sense of beauty in all its forms, a subtle fancy and an originality of speculation, an energy of political life, and a delight of subordinating the individual to the state, such as the world has never again known. The Greeks were more modern in many respects than the peoples of medieval Europe, and in some respects were even in advance of our own time. But they did not attain to the conception of the dignity of man as man. They regarded slavery as an ordinance of nature. They tolerated agriculture, but they looked on all other industries as involving degradation, and they knew little or nothing of those economic problems which are of absorbing interest to our own age. They had never felt the extreme pressure of poverty. earth and sea and sun and sky had combined to make it easy for them to obtain the material requisites for a perfect life. Even their slaves had considerable opportunities of culture. And had it been otherwise, there was nothing in the Greek temper and nothing in the lessons that the world had up to that time learnt to make them seriously concerned. The excellence of Greek thought has made it a touchstone by which many of the leading thinkers of the after ages have tried every new inquiry, and the impatience with which the academic mind has often regarded the study of economics is in great measure due to the impatience which the Greeks felt for the anxious care and plodding work of business. And yet a lesson might have been learnt from the decadence of Greece, which was brought about by the want of that solid earnestness of purpose which no race has ever maintained for many generations without the discipline of steady industry. Socially and intellectually, they were free, but they had not learnt to use their freedom well. They had no self-mastery, no steady, persistent resolution. They had all the quickness of perception and readiness for new suggestions, which are elements of business enterprise, but they had not its fixity on purpose and patient endurance. A genial climate slowly relaxed their physical energies. They were without that safeguard to strength of character which comes from resolute and steadfast persistence in hard work, and at last they sank into frivolity. Section 4. Civilization, still moving westwards, had its next center in Rome. The Romans were a great army, rather than a great nation. They resembled the Greeks in leaving business as much as possible to slaves, but in most other respects were a contrast to them. In opposition to the fresh fullness of the life of the Athenians, to the youthful joy with which they gave free play to all their faculties and developed their own idiosyncrasy, the Romans showed the firm will, the iron resolution, the absorption in definite, serious aims of the mature man. Singularly free from the restraints of custom, they shaped their own lives for themselves with a deliberate choice that had never been known before. They were strong and daring, steady of purpose and abundant in resource, orderly in habit and clear-sighted in judgment. And thus, though they preferred war and politics, they had in constant use all the faculties required for business enterprise. Nor was the principle of association inactive. Trade guilds had some vigor in spite of the paucity of artisans who were free. Those methods of combined action for business purposes and of production on a large scale by slave labor in factories, in which Greece had been the pupil of the East, gained new strength when imported into Rome. The faculties and the temper of the Romans fitted them especially well for the management of joint stock companies, and a comparatively small number of very wealthy men, with no middle class, were able, with the aid of trained slaves and freed men, to undertake large contracts by land and by sea at home and abroad. They made capital hateful, but they made it powerful and efficient. They developed the appliances of money lending with great energy, and partly in consequence of the unity of the imperial power and the wide extent of the Roman language, there was in some important respects more freedom of commerce and of movement throughout the civilized world in the days of the Roman Empire than even now. When then we recollect how great a center of wealth Rome was, how monstrous the fortunes of individual Romans, and they have only recently been surpassed, and how vast the scale of her military and civil affairs, of the provision needed for them and of the machinery of her traffic, we cannot wonder that many writers have thought they found much resemblance between her economic problems and our own. But the resemblance is superficial and illusory. It extends only to forms and not to the living spirit of national life. It does not extend to the recognition of the worth of the life of the common people, which in our time is giving to economic science its highest interest. In ancient Rome, industry and commerce lacked the vital strength which they have attained in more recent times. Her imports were won by the sword. They were not bought with the products of skilled work in which the citizens took a worthy pride, as were those of Venice or Florence or Bruges. Traffic and industry alike were pursued almost with a sole eye to the money gains to be derived from them, and the tone of business life was degraded by the public disdain which shows itself in the legal and practically effective restriction of the senators from all forms of business except those connected with the land. The equities found their richest gains in farming the taxes, in the plunder of provinces, and in later times, in the personal favor of the emperors, and did not cherish that spirit of probity and thorough work which are needed for the making of a great national trade. And at length, private enterprise was stifled by the ever-growing shadow of the state. But though the Romans contributed but little directly to the progress of economic science, yet indirectly they exerted a profound influence over it, for good and evil, by laying the foundations of modern jurisprudence. What philosophic thought there was in Rome was chiefly Stoic, and most of the great Roman Stoics were of Oriental origin. Their philosophy, when transplanted to Rome, developed a great practical power without losing its intensity of feeling, and in spite of its severity, it had in it much that is kindred to the suggestions of modern social science. Most of the great lawyers of the empire were among its adherents, and thus it set the tone of the later Roman law, and through it of all modern European law. Now the strength of the Roman state had caused states' rights to extinguish those of the clan and the tribe in Rome at an earlier stage than in Greece. But many of the primitive Aryan habits of thought as to property lingered on for a long while, even in Rome. Great as was the power of the head of the family over its members, the property which he controlled was for a long time regarded as vested in him as the representative of the family, rather than as an individual. But when Rome had become imperial, her lawyers became the ultimate interpreters of the legal rights of many nations, and under Stoic influence they set themselves to discover the fundamental laws of nature, which they believed to lie in concealment at the foundation of all particular codes. This search for the universal, as opposed to the accidental elements of justice, acted as a powerful solvent on rights of common holding, for which no other reason than that of local usage could be given. The later Roman law, therefore, gradually but steadily enlarged the sphere of contract, gave it greater precision, greater elasticity, and greater strength. At last, almost all social arrangements had come under its dominion. The property of the individual was clearly marked out, and he could deal with it as he pleased. From the breadth and nobility of the Stoic character, modern lawyers have inherited a high standard of duty, and from its austere self-determination, they have derived a tendency to define sharply individual rights and property. And therefore, to Roman, and especially Stoic influence, we may trace indirectly much of the good and evil of our present economic system. On the one hand, much of the untrammeled vigor of the individual in managing his own affairs, and on the other, not a little harsh wrong done under the cover of rights established by a system of law, which has held its ground because its main principles are wise and just. The strong sense of duty which Stoicism brought with it from its Oriental home had in it something also of Eastern quietism. The Stoic, though active in well-doing, was proud of being superior to the troubles of the world. He took his share in the turmoil of life because it was his duty to do so, but he never reconciled himself to it. His life remained sad and stern, oppressed by the consciousness of his own failures. This inner contradiction, as Hegel says, could not pass away till inward perfection was recognized as an object that could be attained only through self-renunciation, and thus its pursuit was reconciled with those failures which necessarily accompany all social work. For this great change, the intense religious feeling of the Jews prepared the way. But the world was not ready to enter into the fullness of the Christian spirit till a new tone had been given to it by the deep personal affections of the German race. Even among the German peoples, true Christianity made its way slowly, and for a long time after the fall of Rome, there was chaos in Western Europe. Section 5. The Teuton, strong and resolute as he was, found it very difficult to free himself from the bonds of custom and of ignorance. The hardiness and fidelity which gave him his special strength inclined him to cherish overmuch the institutions and customs of his family and his tribe. No other great conquering race has shown so little capacity as the Teutons have done for adopting new ideas from the more cultured, though weaker people whom they conquered. They prided themselves on their rude strength and energy, and cared little for knowledge and the arts. But these found a temporary refuge on the eastern coasts of the Mediterranean, until another conquering race coming from the south was ready to give them new life and vigor. The Saracens learned eagerly the best lessons that the conquered had to teach. They nurtured the arts and sciences, and kept alive the torch of learning at a time when the Christian world cared little whether it went out or not. And for this we must ever owe them gratitude. But their moral nature was not so full as that of the Teutons. The warm climate and the sensuality of their religion caused their vigor rapidly to decay, and they have exercised very little direct influence on the problems of modern civilization. The education of the Teutons made slower but surer progress. They carried civilization northward to a climate in which sustained hard work has gone hand in hand with the slow growth of sturdy forms of culture, and they carried it westwards to the Atlantic. Civilization, which had long ago left the shores of the rivers for those of the great inland sea, was ultimately to travel over the vast ocean. But these changes worked themselves out slowly. The first point of interest to us in the New Age is the reopening of the old conflict between town and nation that had been suspended by the universal dominion of Rome, which was indeed an army with headquarters in a town, but drawing its power from the broad land. Section 6. Until a few years ago, complete and direct self-government by the people was impossible in a great nation. It could exist only in towns or very small territories. Government was necessarily in the hands of the few, who looked upon themselves as privileged upper classes, and who treated the workers as lower classes. Consequently, the workers, even when permitted to manage their own local affairs, were often wanting in the courage, self-reliance, and the habits of mental activity, which are required as the basis of business enterprise. And as a matter of fact, both the central government and the local magnates did interfere directly with the freedom of industry, prohibiting migration and levying taxes and tolls of the most burdensome and vexatious character. Even those of the lower classes who were nominally free were plundered by arbitrary fines and dues levied under all manner of excuses, by the partial administration of justice, and often by direct violence and open pillage. These burdens fell chiefly on just those people who were more industrious and more thrifty than their neighbors, for among whom, if the country had been free, the spirit of bold enterprise would gradually have arisen to shake off the bonds of tradition and custom. Far different was the state of the people in the towns. There the industrial classes found strength in their numbers, and even when unable to gain the upper hand altogether, they were not, like their brethren in the country, treated as though they belonged to a different order of beings from their rulers. In Florence and in Bruges, as in ancient Athens, the whole people could hear, and sometimes did hear, from the leaders of public policy a statement of their plans and the reasons for them, and could signify their approval or disapproval before the next step was taken. The whole people could on occasion discuss together the social and industrial problems of the time, knowing each other's counsel, profiting by each other's experience, working out in common a definite resolution and bringing it into effect by their own action. But nothing of this kind could be done over a wide area till the invention of the telegraph, the railway, and the cheap press. By their aid, a nation can now read in the morning what its leaders have said on the evening before, and ere another day has passed, the judgment of the nation on it is pretty well known. By their aid, the council of a large trades union can at a trifling cost submit a difficult question to the judgment of their members in every part of the country and get their decision within a few days. Even a large country can now be ruled by its people. But till now, what was called popular government was a physical necessity, the government by a more or less wide oligarchy. Only those few who could themselves go frequently to the center of government, or at least receive constant communication from it, could take part directly in government. And though a much larger number of people would know enough of what was going on to make their will broadly effective through their choice of representatives, yet even they were a small minority of the nation till a few years ago, and the representative system itself is only of recent date. Section 7. In the Middle Ages, the history of the rise and fall of towns is the history of the rise and fall of successive waves on the tide of progress. The medieval towns, as a rule, owed their origin to trade and industry, and did not despise them. And though the wealthier citizens were sometimes able to set up a close government in which the workers had no part, they seldom retained their power long. The great body of the inhabitants frequently had the full rights of the citizens, deciding for themselves the foreign and domestic policy of their city, and at the same time working with their hands and taking pride in their work. They organized themselves into guilds, thus increasing their cohesion and educating themselves in self-government. And though the guilds were often exclusive, and their trade regulations ultimately retarded progress, yet they did excellent work before this deadening influence had shown itself. The citizens gained culture without losing energy, without neglecting their business. They learned to take an intelligent interest in the many things besides their business. They led the way in the fine arts, and they were not backward in those of war. They took pride in magnificent expenditure for public purposes, and they took equal pride in the careful husbanding of the public resources, in clear and clean state budgets, and in system of taxes levied equitably and based on sound business principles. Thus they led the way towards modern industrial civilization, and if they had gone on their course undisturbed and retained their first love of liberty and social equality, they would probably long ago have worked out the solutions of many social and economic problems, which we are only now beginning to face. But after being long troubled by tumults and war, they at last succumbed to the growing power of the countries by which they were surrounded. And indeed, when they had obtained dominion over their neighbors, their own rule had often been harsh and oppressive, so that their ultimate overthrow by the country was in some degree the result of a just retribution. They have suffered for their wrongdoings, but the fruit of their good work remains and is the source of much that is best in the social and economic traditions that our age has inherited from its predecessors. Section 8. Feudalism was perhaps a necessary stage in the development of the Teutonic race. It gave scope to the political ability of the dominant class and educated the common people in habits of discipline and order. But it concealed under forms of some outward beauty much cruelty and uncleanness, physical and moral. The practices of chivalry combined extreme deference to women in public with domestic tyranny. Elaborate rules of courtesy towards combatants of the knightly order were maintained by the side of cruelty and extortion in dealing with the lower classes. The ruling classes were expected to discharge their obligations towards one another with frankness and generosity. They had ideals of life which were not devoid of nobility, and therefore their characters will always have some attractiveness to the thoughtful historian, as well as to the chroniclers of wars, of splendid shows, and of romantic incidents. But their consciences were satisfied when they had acted up to the code of duty which their own class required of them. And one article of that code was to keep the lower classes in their place, though indeed they were often kind and even affectionate towards those retainers with whom they lived in daily contact. So far as cases of individual hardship went, the Church strove to defend the weak and to diminish the sufferings of the poor. Perhaps those finer natures who were attracted to the service might often have exercised a wider and a better influence if they had been free from the vow of celibacy and able to mingle with the world. But this is no reason for rating lightly the benefit which the clergy, and still more the monks, rendered to the poorer classes. The monasteries were the homes of industry, and in particular of the scientific treatment of agriculture. They were secure colleges for the learned, and they were hospitals and almshouses for the suffering. The Church acted as a peacemaker in great matters and in small. The festivals and the markets held under its authority gave freedom and safety to trade. Again, the Church was a standing protest against caste exclusiveness. It was democratic in its organization, as was the army of ancient Rome. It was always willing to raise to the highest posts the ablest men, in whatever rank they were born. Its clergy and monastic orders did much for the physical and moral well-being of the people, and it sometimes even led them in open resistance to the tyranny of their rulers. But on the other hand, it did not set itself to help them to develop their faculties of self-reliance and self-determination, and to attain truer inner freedom. While willing that those individuals who had exceptional natural talents should rise through its own offices to the highest posts, it helped rather than hindered the forces of feudalism in their endeavor to keep the working classes as a body, ignorant, devoid of enterprise, and in every way dependent on those above them. Teutonic feudalism was more kindly in its instincts than the military dominion of ancient Rome, and the laity as well as the clergy were influenced by the teachings, imperfectly understood as they were, of the Christian religion with regard to the dignity of man as man. Nevertheless, the rulers of the country districts during the Middle Ages united all that was the most powerful in the Oriental subtlety of theocratic caste and in the Roman force of discipline and resolution, and they used their combined strength in such a manner as, on the whole, to retard the growth of strength and independence of character among the lower orders of the people. The military force of feudalism was, however, for a long time weakened by local jealousies. It was admirably adapted for welding into one living whole, the government of a vast area under the genius of a Charles the Great. But it was equally prone to dissipate itself into its constituent elements as soon as its guiding genius was gone. Italy was for a long time ruled by its towns, one of which indeed, of Roman descent, with Roman ambition and hard fixity of purpose, held its waterways against all attack till quite modern times. And in the Netherlands and other parts of the continent, the free towns were long able to defy the hostility of the kings and barons around them. But at length stable monarchies were established in Austria, Spain, and France. A despotic monarchy, served by a few able men, drilled and organized the military forces of vast multitudes of ignorant but sturdy country folk. And the enterprise of free towns, their noble combination of industry and culture, was cut short before they had time to outgrow their early mistakes. Then the world might have gone backwards if it had not happened that just at that time new forces were rising to break up the bonds of constraint and spread freedom over the broad land. Within a very short period came the invention of printing, the revival of learning, the Reformation, and the discovery of the ocean routes to the New World and to India. Any one of these events alone would have been sufficient to make an epoch in history. But coming together as they did, and working all in the same direction, they effected a complete revolution. Thought became comparatively free, and knowledge ceased to be altogether inaccessible to the people. The free temper of the Greeks revived, the strong, self-determining spirits gained new strength, and were able to extend their influence over others. and a new continent suggested new problems to the thoughtful, at the same time that it offered a new scope to the enterprise of bold adventurers. End of Appendix A, Sections 1 through 8. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Appendix A, Sections 9 through 17 of Principles of Economics. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Principles of Economics by Alfred Marshall. Appendix A, Sections 9 through 17. The Growth of Free Industry and Enterprise. Section 9. The countries which took the lead in the new maritime adventure were those of the Spanish Peninsula. It seemed for a time that though the leadership of the world, having settled first in the most easterly peninsula of the Mediterranean, and thence moved to the Middle Peninsula, would settle again in that westerly peninsula which belonged both to the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. But the power of industry had by this time become sufficient to sustain wealth and civilization in a northern climate. Spain and Portugal could not hold their own for long against the more sustained energy and the more generous spirit of the northern people. The early history of the people of the Netherlands is indeed a brilliant romance. Founding themselves on fishing and weaving, they built up a noble fabric of art and literature, of science and government. But Spain set herself to crush out the rising spirit of freedom, as Persia had done before. And as Persia strangled Ionia, but only raised yet higher the spirit of Greece proper, so the Austro-Spanish Empire subdued the Belgian Netherlands, but only intensified the patriotism and energy of the Dutch Netherlands and England. Holland suffered from England's jealousy of her commerce, but still more from the restless military ambition of France. It soon became clear that Holland was defending the freedom of Europe against French aggression. But at a critical time in her history, she was deprived of the aid she might reasonably have expected from Protestant England. And though from 1688 onwards that aid was liberally given, her bravest and most generous sons had then already perished on the battlefield, and she was overburdened with debt. She has fallen into the background, but Englishmen above all others are bound to acknowledge what she did and what more she might have done for freedom and enterprise. France and England were thus left to contend for the empire of the ocean. France had greater natural resources than any other northern country, and more of the spirit of the new age than any southern country. And she was for some time the greatest power in the world. But she squandered in perpetual wars her wealth and the blood of the best of those citizens whom she had not already driven away by religious persecution. The progress of enlightenment brought with it no generosity on the part of the ruling class towards the ruled, and no wisdom in expenditure. From revolutionary America came the chief impulse towards a rising of the oppressed French people against their rulers. But the French were strikingly wanting in that self-controlling freedom which had distinguished the American colonists. Their energy and courage was manifested again in the great Napoleonic Wars. But their ambition overleaped itself and ultimately left to England the leadership of enterprise on the ocean. Thus, the industrial problems of the New World are being worked out under the direct influence, and to some extent those of the Old World are under the indirect influence of the English character. We may then return to trace with somewhat more detail the growth of free enterprise in England. Section 10. England's geographical position caused her to be peopled by the strongest members of the strongest races of Northern Europe. A process of natural selection brought to her shores those members of each successive migratory wave who were most daring and self-reliant. Her climate is better adapted to sustain energy than any other in the Northern Hemisphere. She is divided by no high hills, and no part of her territory is more than 20 miles from navigable water, and thus there was no material hindrance to freedom of intercourse between her different parts. While the strength and wise policy of the Norman and Plantagenet kings prevented artificial barriers from being raised by local magnates. As the part which Rome played in history is chiefly due to her having combined the military strength of a great empire with the enterprise and fixedness of purpose of an oligarchy residing in one city, so England owes her greatness to her combining, as Holland had done on a smaller scale before, much of the free temper of the medieval city with the strength and broad basis of a nation. The towns of England had been less distinguished than those of other lands, but she assimilated them more easily than any other country did, and so gained in the long run most from them. The custom of primogeniture inclined the younger sons of noble families to seek their own fortunes, and having no special caste privileges, they mixed readily with the common people. This fusion of different ranks tended to make politics businesslike, while it warmed the veins of business adventure with the generous daring and romantic aspirations of noble blood. Resolute on the one hand in resistance to tyranny, and on the other in submission to authority when it is justified by their reason, the English have made many revolutions, but none without a definite purpose. While reforming the Constitution, they have abided by the law. They alone, unless we except the Dutch, have known how to combine order and freedom. They alone have united a thorough reverence of the past with the power of living for the future, rather than in the past. But the strength of character which in later times made England the leader of manufacturing progress showed itself at first chiefly in politics, in war, and in agriculture. The English archer was the forerunner of the English artisan. He had the same pride in the superiority of his food and his physique over those of his continental rivals. He had the same indomitable perseverance in acquiring perfect command over the use of his hands, the same free independence, and the same power of self-control and of rising to emergencies, the same habit of indulging his humors when the occasion was fit, but when a crisis arose, of preserving discipline even in the face of hardship and misfortune. But the industrial faculties of Englishmen remained latent for a long time. They had not inherited much acquaintance with, nor much care for the comforts and luxuries of civilization. In manufactures of all kinds, they lagged behind the Latin countries, Italy, France, and Spain, as well as the free cities of Northern Europe. Gradually, the wealthier classes got some taste for imported luxuries, and England's trade slowly increased. But there was for a long time no sign on the surface of her future commerce. That indeed is the product of her special circumstances as much as, if not more than, of any natural bias of her people. They had not originally, and they have not now, that special liking for dealing and bargaining, nor for the more abstract side of financial business, which is found among the Jews, the Italians, the Greeks, and the Armenians. Trade with them has always taken the form of action rather than of maneuvering and speculative combination. Even now, the subtlest financial speculation on the London Stock Exchange is done chiefly by those races which have inherited the same aptitude for trading which the English have for action. The qualities which have caused England in later times, under different circumstances, to explore the world and to make goods and carry them for other countries, caused her even in the Middle Ages to pioneer the modern organization of agriculture, and thus to set the model after which most other modern business is being molded. She took the lead in converting labor dues into money payments, a change which much increased the power of everyone to steer his course in life according to his own free choice. For good and for evil, the people were set free to exchange away their rights in the land and their obligations to it. The relaxation of the bonds of custom was hastened alike by the great rise of real wages, which followed the Black Death in the 14th century, and by the great fall of real wages, which in the 16th century resulted from the depreciation of silver, the debasement of coin, the appropriation of the revenues of the monasteries to the purposes of court extravagance, and lastly by the extension of sheep farming, which set many workers adrift from their old homes and lowered the real incomes and altered the mode of life of those who remained. The movement was further extended by the growth of the royal power in the hands of the Tudors, which put an end to private war and rendered useless the bands of retainers which the barons and landed gentry had kept together. The habit of leaving real property to the eldest son and distributing personal property among all the members of the family, on the one hand increased the size of landed properties, and on the other narrowed the capital which the owners of land had at their own command for working it. These causes tended to establish the relation of landlord and tenant in England, while the foreign demand for English work and the English demand for foreign luxuries led, especially in the 16th century, to the concentration of many holdings into large sheep runs worked by capitalist farmers. That is, there was a great increase in the number of farmers who undertook the management and risks of agriculture, supplying some capital of their own, but borrowing the land for a definite yearly payment and hiring labor for wages. In like manner as, later on, the new order of English businessmen undertook the management and the risks of manufacture, supplying some capital of their own, but borrowing the rest on interest and hiring labor for wages. Free enterprise grew fast and fiercely, and it was one-sided in its action and cruel to the poor. But it remains true that the English large farm, arable and pastoral, worked with borrowed capital, was the forerunner of the English factory, in the same way as English archery was the forerunner of the skill of the English artisan. Section 11. Meanwhile, the English character was deepening. The natural gravity and intrepidity of the stern races that had settled on the shores of England inclined them to embrace the doctrine of the Reformation, and these reacted on their habits of life and gave a tone to their industry. Man was, as it were, ushered straight into the presence of his Creator, with no human intermediary. And now, for the first time, large numbers of rude and uncultured people yearned toward the mysteries of absolute spiritual freedom. The isolation of each person's religious responsibility for that of his fellows, rightly understood, was a necessary condition for the highest spiritual progress. But the notion was new to the world. It was bare and naked, not yet overgrown with pleasant instincts. And even in kindly natures, individuality showed itself with a hard sharpness of outline, while the coarser natures became self-conscious and egotistic. Among the Puritans especially, the eagerness to give logical definiteness and precision to their religious creed was an absorbing passion, hostile to all lighter thoughts and lighter amusements. When occasion arose when they could take combined action, which was made irresistible by their resolute will. But they took little joy in society. They shunned public amusements and preferred the quieter relaxations of home life. And it must be confessed, some of them took an attitude hostile to art. The first growth of strength had then something in it that was rude and ill-mannered. But that strength was required for the next stage upwards. It needed to be purified and softened by much tribulation. It needed to become less self-assertive without becoming weaker, before new instincts could grow up around it to revive in a higher form what was most beautiful and most solid in the old collective tendencies. It intensified the affections of the family, the richest and fullest of earthly feelings. Perhaps there never has been before any material of texture, at once so strong and so fine, with which to build up a noble fabric of social life. Holland and other countries shared with England the great ordeal which was thus opened by the spiritual upheaval that closed the Middle Ages. But from many points of view, and especially from that of the economist, England's experiences were the most instructive and the most thorough, and were typical of all the rest.
Okay.
England led the way in the modern evolution of industry and enterprise by free and self-determining energy and will. Section 12. England's industrial and commercial characteristics were intended.
Okay, thank you, Alfred. This is the part of the big show, ladies and gentlemen, where I do the banishing ritual. I close the seance and send Alfred Marshall's spirit back to the depths of economist hell. Spirit, be gone, till I call you forth again. Be gone, I say! Okay, so ladies and gents, now we're going to be talking about timely top stories in the world of finance. By the way, caller lines are wide open. If you'd like to call in, be a part of the big show, please feel free. I know those of you watching on YouTube are like, what? What the heck? You got a call-in line. Yeah, I do have a call-in line, but I'm actually doing a simulcast. I'm on Blog Talk Radio right now as well. So if you'd like to call in, whether you're on YouTube or watching on YouTube or listening on Blog Talk Radio, that number is 657-383-1825, 657-383-1825. There's no screening of phone calls. You talk about whatever the hell you want. Any recommendations, suggestions about which direction you would like the show to go in. If you want to try and troll me, knock me off my game, which isn't real hard to do, but whatever, man. I don't really care. So do what you got to do. Caller lines are wide open. 657-383-1825. Still got a little under an hour left in the big show. So get your thoughts together. Maybe write down 3 bullet points so you can sound halfway intelligent on the air. All right. So anyway, let's get this shindig started. Free trials are costing Americans a fortune. Coming at you from Fox Business. Free trials costing Americans a fortune. What are they talking about? What you talking about, Willis? All right, come on, already.
Old Dominion has ranked #1 in overall performance 9 years straight. Customers trust OD for damage-free deliveries and real-time shipment visibility.
What is
never
this?
stop working toward perfection.
Wait a minute.
Old
Is this a
Dominion,
video?
helping the world keep promises.
Subscription economy is relatively new.
Okay, I guess so. I don't know what that was. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. Nothing in life is free, right? Companies continue to market trials as such to wrangle in curious customers. It seems simple enough, but those free trial promotions usually mean entering a credit or debit card number in exchange for a service. This is convenient if you actually enjoy the service and plan on using it again in the future, but a number of Americans get trapped and lose money to auto-renewing subscriptions when these trials expire. Ted Rothman, industry analyst for consumer financial service company Bankrate, told Fox Business nearly 6 in 10 U.S. adults who signed up for a free trial were later charged against their will. So we want to look out for that, ladies and gentlemen. Nearly 59% U.S. adults who signed up for a free trial were later charged against their will. Okay, that's uncool. That is uncool, man. The figure comes straight from Bankrate's 2019 online shopping survey last week. It also found that 64% of American cardholders allow their financial information to be saved when making purchases, despite nearly half of respondents believing it is unsafe to do so. In the case of free trials, failing to remove a card number or a linked payment account ensures a business has access to your funds. Okay, this is all really just common sense. I don't even know how this article ended up in my news cycle. This is not very hard-hitting journalism, hard-hitting financial journalism that my listeners come to expect from me. But all right, so have come to expect from me. But let's move on, shall we? Okay, let's do that. Let's talk about Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies. Everyone loves talking about that in the world of finance. Always timely and newsworthy. Okay, Bitcoin, ETH, XRP, LTC, and XLM rally. Is it for real? Well, I shall tell you. A rally in major cryptocurrencies that began at the end of the previous week continued last week, spreading to smaller cryptocurrencies. As of Saturday evening, Bitcoin had gained 1.7% over the previous 7 days, ETH 2.66%, XRP 1.91%, LTC 4.91%, and XLM 12.71%, with 78 out of the top 100 cryptocurrencies advancing and 22 declining. A strong advanced decline ratio indicates that the rally is for real, fueled by new money flowing into the cryptocurrency markets, rather than rotating from, what is this? Leave me alone, please. Rather than rotating from one cryptocurrency to another. Then there's the news that China is ready to embrace blockchain technology and develop its own digital currency. That's something markets expected to hear as Facebook's Libra has been falling apart. Nicholas Pelikanos, advisor to NEM Ventures, thinks that BTC is ready for a breakout as trades near the top of its range. The tremendous 40% rally we witnessed at the end of last week certainly shows the market participants are still bullish, he says. But he thinks that China's renewed interest in blockchain favors protocols like Ethereum and NEM rather than Bitcoin. Personally, I believe the news that China will embrace blockchain is not as bullish for Bitcoin as the rally may have hinted to. I don't believe giving Chinese citizens sovereignty of wealth is high on the current regime's agenda, he says. The news is, however, bullish for protocols like Ethereum and NEM that can support the applications the Chinese government may be looking to embrace. Ryan Ure, a CEO and co-founder of CoinPlug Inc., thinks that China will always keep a firm control of cryptocurrencies that allow citizens to hide assets. Cryptocurrencies that are developed and managed independently of the Chinese government provide the means for citizens to hide assets, he says. This means that the government will most likely keep cryptocurrencies, including Bitcoin and Libra, under tight control in the domestic market. Simply put, Bitcoin and other major current cryptocurrencies won't see meaningful impact from China's cryptocurrency embrace, and that will eventually deflate the hype behind the recent rally and the return to the old sideways pattern. But that may not be a bad thing. A sideways BTC doesn't mean opportunities will cease to present themselves, he says. One area he sees such opportunities is short LTCUSD, as its hash rate has been falling. I don't see LTC making any meaningful pullback until the hash rate begins to climb again, he says. One area where he sees such opportunities is short LTCUSD, as its hash rate has been falling. Okay, all right, against the climb, he says. So, meanwhile, Pelicanos is concerned about the volatility in BTC's hash rate. Speaking of hash rate, while everyone was distracted by the China embracing blockchain news, the Bitcoin hash rate slid over 30% from its high, he says. The hash rate has since rallied around 10%, but further destabilization to the hash rate could cause BTC to head back down to the bottom of its range. Okay, moving on. Okay, let's see here. I'll tell you over there. McDonald's CEO Steve Easterbrook is out for consensual relationship with an employee. Well, we'll see. Let's see what's going on here. I mean, why would he be out for a consensual relationship with an employee? Well, I don't know. Come on. Steve Easterbrook is out as McDonald's CEO and president after the board determined that he violated company policy, the company said on Sunday. Easterbrook, who became CEO in 2015, demonstrated poor judgment involving a recent consensual relationship with an employee, McDonald's said in a statement. Okay. I'm not liking this site at all. He has separated from the company and has been replaced in both roles.
This just in. CEO of McDonald's, Steve Easterbrook, is out after he allegedly violated company policy. According to a statement from McDonald's, Easterbrook demonstrated poor judgment in.
Oh my God! I waited that long for a 30-second video. Okay.
He has since been the CEO.
Oh, come on!
McDonald's
Don't care.
Forbids managers from having romantic relationships with direct.
Don't care, lady.
Reports. Employees.
Don't care. All right. That was so anticlimactic. All right, moving on. 3 value stocks to buy right now. Coming at you from the Motley Fool. Bargains are hard to find in today's market. Here are a few picks to jumpstart your search. With the stock market near all-time highs, value stocks have been mostly overlooked over the last decade. But lately, we've seen signs that investors may be coming back to value stocks. High-priced cloud computing stocks have mostly pulled back in recent months, while low-priced sectors like retail and energy have gotten a second look from investors. In light of that, now may be a particularly good time to consider value stocks. Keep reading, keep listening, okay, to see why Facebook, Macy's, and AMC Networks all look like good candidates for bargain hunters. Keep listening. Here it comes. The social network. It may seem odd to see Facebook's name on a list of value stocks. After all, the tech giant is still young and growing fast. But Facebook has a number of attributes that should make it appealing to investors who know that value is more than a low price. Facebook's generally accepted accounting principles, earnings, have been repressed through the first half of the year by fines from the Federal Trade Commission over privacy violations and an appeals court decision. But the company's earnings potential shined in its third quarter earnings report as earnings per share jumped 20% to $2.12, ahead of estimates at $1.91. Backing out the one-time events, including the fines, Facebook has earned $8.38 per share over the last year, giving it a P/E ratio of 20, price to earnings ratio of 23, essentially even with the S&P 500's P/E at 22.6. Price to earnings ratio at 22.6. Accounting for the $52.3 billion in cash and investments Facebook has on its balance sheet, Facebook's price to earning is 21, and that's for a company growing much faster than the average firm in the S&P 500. Through the first 3 quarters of the year, Facebook's revenue has grown 27.5%, and the company has a huge economic moat thanks to the network effects and switching costs inherent in a social network of more than 2 billion people. Its high margins should give value investors some security that its business model is defensible and enduring. Headline risk may be an occasional thorn in the company's side, and lingering criticism of the company may be the reason that the company isn't priced higher. But considering its growth rate, the stock looks cheap. Capitalize on an out-of-fashion retailer. Macy's has been the worst performing stock in the S&P 500 this year, falling 48% as the company has trimmed its earnings guidance, and worries have mounted that it could follow the path of Sears and JCPenney into oblivion. However, Macy's stock has now gotten too cheap to ignore, and there are a number of reasons why. The company doesn't deserve to be lumped in with its ailing peers. First, Macy's is solidly profitable and is on track to generate nearly $1 billion in profits this year. Second, comparable sales continue to move in the right direction. They have edged up 0.4% this year, though margin compression has been a concern. Gross margin has fallen from 38.5% to 39.7%, which is part of the reason the company was forced to cut its guidance. Finally, Macy's has a trove of valuable real estate that it's slowly spinning off and unlocking the value of. For instance, the company recently said it would sell its downtown Seattle store at the end of the holiday season. and it's planning to build an 800-foot tall office tower over its flagship store in New York's Herald Square. This year, the company expects to have $100 million in asset sale gains, and its real estate was valued at around $16 billion by the investment firm Cohen in 2016. By comparison, the company's market cap is just $4.8 billion. To further entice value seekers, the stock also offers a well-funded dividend yielding 9.7%. To be fair, Macy's is risky considering the upheaval in retail, but the stock is now trading at a P/V of less than 6 based on this year's expected earnings per share, and its real estate should put a floor on the stock. Cable isn't dead yet. Investors talking about cord cutting for years. Investors have been talking about cord cutting for years. But the decline of cable has actually been much slower than you might think. AMC Networks, the home of hit shows like The Walking Dead and Killing Eve, continues to grow revenue with the help of international markets, and its earnings per share also rose 8% through the first half of the year to $4.73 with the help of share buybacks. Though AMC is best known as a cable provider with networks including its namesake, BBC America, WeTV, Sundance, and IFC, the company has planted its flag in the streaming channel with a number of growing services, including Acorn TV, UMC, Shudder, and Sundance Now. AMC has also been aggressively buying back its stock, taking advantage of the low price of its shares, which now trade at a P/V of just 5. However, the biggest reason for value investors to consider AMC Networks is its appeal as an acquisition target. The company's back catalog includes several popular shows like Mad Men, Breaking Bad, and Portlandia, and with a number of new streaming services set to launch, demand for content has never been greater. Mergers and acquisitions have been common in the cable industry lately, as a wave of consolidation has hit and networks have looked to partner up to leverage content and other assets for prospective streaming platforms. CBS recently merged with Viacom, and Discovery acquired Scripps Network, playing a significant premium. Considering its valuable library of content and track record of producing hits, AMC should be a valuable prize in the streaming wars. And even without a buyout, it can still deliver a steady stream of cash flows that offer a good value at today's price. 10 stocks that the Motley Fool likes better than Facebook. When investing geniuses David and Tom Gardner have a stock tip, it can pay to listen. After all, the newsletter they have ran for over a decade. Have run for over a decade. Motley Fool Stock Advisor has quadrupled the market. The newsletter Motley Fool Stock Advisor has quadrupled the market. David and Tom just revealed what they believe are the 10 best stocks for investors to buy right now. And Facebook wasn't one of them. That's right. They think these 10 stocks are even better buys. Okay, now it's one. Let's see. This is AMC Networks a buy. Okay. All right, I'm not going there. Okay, I think this is sort of. Let's see. I don't know if this is a clever
Hey, do you want to know why
a clever
literally
ad or
hundreds of
what?
thousands of investors are getting their advice from Motley Fool
No.
Stock Advisor? Well, it's simple.
Okay.
Our average
Yeah.
stock
Okay.
returned
Sorry about that,
338%.
ladies and
That's more
gents.
than 4 times the return of the
Yeah,
S&P.
yeah. It's sort of an invitation, I guess, to go to get the premium. To go to the premium section of the Motley Fool, which there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I highly recommend the Motley Fool. It's a great financial site. There's tons of good stuff, good free stuff there to browse through. But they have a premium section as well, and that's that's once you get your feet wet a little bit in the world of finance and you sort of know what you're doing. It's probably worth it, to go ahead and spring for that premium site. But Motley Fool is making the world smarter, happier, and richer. I guess that's their mission statement. Krispy Kreme orders student to halt donut resale service. Coming at you from Yahoo Finance. The fine folks at Yahoo Finance. Okay. St. Paul, Minnesota. Actually, it's from the Associated Press. An enterprising Minnesota college student who drove to Iowa every weekend to buy hundreds of Krispy Kreme donuts that he then sold to his own customers in the Twin Cities area has been warned by the confectionery giant to stop. There have been no Krispy Kreme stores in Minnesota for 11 years. Jason Gonzalez of Champlin, Minnesota, would drive 270 miles, 430 kilometers to all of those people outside of the States, to a Krispy Kreme store in Clive, Iowa. Pack his car with up to 100 boxes, each carrying 12 donuts, then drive back up north to deliver them to customers in Minneapolis, St. Paul. He charged $17 to $20 per box. He said some of his customers spent nearly $100 each time. Are they really that good? Not much of a donut guy, but okay, let's see here. Gonzalez said he did not receive a discount from the store in Iowa where he bought the donuts. But less than a week after the St. Paul Pioneer Press reported on his money-making scheme, Gonzalez received a phone call from Krispy Kreme's Nebraska office telling him to stop. The senior studying accounting at Metropolitan State University in St. Paul said he was told his sales created a liability for the North Carolina-based company. In a statement Sunday night, Krispy Kreme said, "It's looking into the matter. We appreciate Jason's passion for Krispy Kreme and his entrepreneurial spirit as he pursues his education," the statement read. Gonzalez, also known as the Donut Guy, would have made his 20th run to Iowa on Saturday. He told his Facebook followers on Thursday that he has been told he has to shut down operations. Life happens, and it could be a sign that something else is meant to be. Gonzalez posted. Well, like most entrepreneurs, he's a very optimistic young man. Okay, but all righty, moving on. See, we got Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross says licenses for U.S. companies to sell Huawei coming very shortly. Huawei. God, I hope that's how you pronounce that. Otherwise, I'm going to look like a real asshole. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross says licenses for U.S. companies to sell Huawei coming very shortly. Key points. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross said Sunday that licenses for United States companies to sell components to Chinese telecom giant Huawei are coming very shortly. In May, the Trump administration placed Huawei and dozens of other Chinese firms on the Commerce Department's entity list, citing national security concerns. Last month, Trump gave the green light to begin approving licenses for a select few American companies to bypass the ban, but none have been granted yet. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross said Sunday that licenses for United States companies to sell components to Chinese telecom giant Huawei are coming very shortly, and expressed hope that the U.S. would reach a trade deal with China this month. We're in good shape, we're making good progress, and there's no natural reason why it couldn't be, Ross said during an interview on Bloomberg Television in Bangkok. But whether it will slip a little bit, who knows? It's always possible. Following the cancellation of this month's Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in Chile due to protests in the country, Ross said that the deal between President Donald Trump and Xi Jinping could be reached in one of several locations, including Iowa, Alaska, Hawaii, or somewhere in China. Last month, the U.S. and China reached a truce and started working to finalize the first phase of a trade agreement, which includes a pause in tariff escalation and China buying U.S. agriculture products. Ross, however, was non-committal on whether the Trump administration would suspend a December tariff hike. While Trump has said the Phase 1 trade deal represents 60% of a long-term agreement, reports have shown that China is doubtful about reaching a long-term comprehensive trade deal. In May, the Trump administration placed Huawei and dozens of other Chinese firms on the Commerce Department's entity list, citing national security concerns. The move blocked Huawei from buying American software from companies like Google and Micron without getting a U.S. government license. The ban has hurt American companies that do business with China. In October, Trump gave the green light to begin approving licenses for a select few American companies to bypass the ban, according to the New York Times, but none have been granted yet. The fact that no licenses have been approved yet has raised some speculation that the White House was withholding them as leverage in China trade negotiations. Ross said on Sunday that the government has gotten 260 requests and assured that the licenses will be forthcoming very shortly. That's a lot of applications. It's frankly more than we would have thought, Ross said. Remember, too, with entity lists, there's a presumption of denial, he continued. So the safe thing for these companies would be to assume denial, even though we will obviously approve quite a few of them. Okay, moving on. What is this local market news? Local market news. Okay. Coming at you from Investors Business Daily. Dow Jones Futures, the most polarizing stock, has its first buy point of 2019. Okay, let's just see. Okay. Mhm.
Look at 3 stocks moving on earnings, including Corvo and Fortinet. But first, let's take a look at the major indexes. So let's the quorum here with Ken Trade. And Ken, we saw strong gains across the board. The NASDAQ and the Dow finishing up about 1.1% each. The S&P 500 closing with a 1% gain. So it looks like strength across the board.
Yeah, we had a better than expected jobs report before the open that fueled early sentiment. And then we had sort of a weak reading from the ISM manufacturing index, but stocks strengthened after that data came out. So in the end, big percentage gains for all 3 major stock indexes, all-time highs for the NASDAQ and the S&P 500. And the Dow tried to hit an all-time high, came pretty close, but closed just a little bit short. But all in all, a great way to end the week for the bulls.
All-time highs. All right. Well, let's take a look at what's happening under the surface, starting with Corvo in the semiconductor space, able to close the day with a gain of over 20% in heavy volume, even closing at session highs, moving on earnings. Now, it did report year-over-year declines on the top and bottom lines, but I think across the chip sector, we have this expectation for a recovery. And even with the declines year over year, it looks like investors liked the look of this report and guidance.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I'm just wondering if there's going to be a show where we're not talking about a semiconductor stock, because it seems like semiconductor stocks are just in the news almost on a daily basis. But definitely just want to take a look at a weekly chart here. Very bullish close for chipmaker Corvo. Big percentage gain. This is a company that operates in 2 segments: mobile products and also infrastructure and defense products. So you mentioned it's a turnaround. So earnings and sales declined in the latest quarter, but Corvo, like many other chip stocks, the market is betting on a turnaround in 2020 and into 2021. So this stock actually looks actionable. A weekly chart, it looks like it broke out from a really long consolidation that started more than a year ago. The open price of $91.89 looked like a legitimate entry, and it might be just a tad extended here, but just weekly chart shows a good solid breakout.
Yeah, that's right. And as you can see, it had been moving, it was range bound in a big consolidation for quite a long time, now blasting to all-time highs. So this is a really bullish looking chart.
Absolutely. And again, the weekly chart, when you stretch it out over a year, you just see just a good solid breakout from a long consolidation. And one of many chip stocks like we've been talking about in recent weeks acting well.
Yeah, that's right. And also let's take a look at a stock in the cybersecurity group, Fortinet, ticker there is FTNT. Now, it gained about 12% for the week, a little under 11% for the day, gapping up on its quarterly earnings report. We did see earnings growth of 37%, sales growth of 21%. That was acceleration from the quarter before, which is good to see. And it is now approaching a potential buy point.
Yeah, not a lot of great news in the software sector in recent weeks. Heavy volume selling that we've noted a lot on this show, but the numbers pretty good at Fortinet, and I think that acceleration in sales growth, the market definitely took notice of that. Look at the weekly chart here. You see that big weekly gain this week. Ironically, it's still just a little bit below a 92.89 buy point here. So this is actually a great one for the watch list. So some might have bought the stock today on the gap up, but this is an example because it's just below that left side high of 92.79. We could get a little handle forming here, and possible we could see an alternate entry in the not too distant future. So the problem is the security software group has fallen all the way down to 180 out of 197 industry groups that we rank. So it's not a real strong industry group in the market right now, but really solid results for Fortinet.
Yeah, that's right. Definitely something to keep in mind. And with a strong gain on earnings, just a reminder that from here, we definitely want to see the stock holding those gains. So it would be a perfect opportunity to see a handle for them. Perhaps.
Yeah, anytime a stock gaps up and it's still slightly inside a base, if you can just get some tight sideways action, oftentimes you get a real legitimate entry and often see another breakout attempt.
All right, and last but not least, let's take a look at Bruker. The ticker there is BRKR in the medical systems and equipment industry group. It gained about 13% for the day, staging a breakout over a consolidation, but it backed off of its highs for the day.
Yeah, but again, the weekly chart provides good perspective here. Similar to Fortinet, it rose powerfully, still slightly below that left side high, so it actually briefly cleared a 51.51 entry, but similar situation to Fortinet here. It's still below that buy point because it did back off, like you mentioned. But if we can get just some little sideways, maybe some low volume selling, last remaining sellers get shaken out of the stock here, it could pave the way for a possible breakout. So mentioned Bruker in the medical systems equipment group. They make scientific instruments for molecular research and kind of a life sciences firm. So this is another good one for the watch list.
Yeah, that's right. And we did see accelerating revenue growth here, up about 12% for the quarter versus 10% in the quarter before. So that is also nice to see. As Ken mentioned, definitely one for the watch list. And a couple of quick announcements before we go. The first of which, this is a new one today. I know we do have a couple of the same announcements every week with some of our weekly features that come out. But this is a new announcement, guys. So we will be having the last ever Canceling Masters program. This year, it's happening the weekend of December 14th and December 15th. Now, Ken, tell us a little bit about the Masters program, because this is our advanced, in-depth training for the year.
Yeah, and 2 full days. So it's 2 full days.
Okay.
Of a very informative workshop.
All right.
Portfolio management.
We don't need to hear about this. But thank you guys. But I don't want to hear about your master's program. All right. So.
Yeah.
But thanks. So thanks for weighing in. I appreciate it. It was great. Great job. All right, moving on. I know you would rather look at the pretty lady, or listen to the pretty lady, but hey, what can you do, right? She might be on the next show. I don't know. Maybe she will, maybe she won't. All right, a market melts up. Oh, okay. There's another. A market melts up is becoming a real risk as stocks hit new highs. Wall Street bull Ed Yardeni warns. Okay. Let's see. Record rally may turn into too much of a good thing. All right, Ed Yardini. We're gonna try and get Ed on the phone. Let's see here. Hello.
Let's see if it's all about bracket orders. Stop price relative.
At its core, fundamental analysis answers to
Stocks and rates. And really, that's it.
Okay. Thank you.
People love to see all-time highs.
Sure.
They like that momentum, but you're a little cautious about this.
Well, I just don't want too much of a good thing here. I'd like this bull market to continue at a leisurely pace, not in a melt-up fashion, and I think that's actually the risk.
Let's talk about 2020. You're at that 3,500 target.
Right.
We have a big election coming up in 2020.
Yes.
How much of the target is based on an outcome that you think is going to happen one way or the other?
Well, look, we could have a radical regime change November 2020. I mean, if Trump loses and we get, for example, Elizabeth Warren, that would be a pretty radical change from a regime of deregulation and tax cuts to one where we will certainly get more regulation. And whether we get tax increases will obviously depend on what the Senate and the House look like. But it would be a radically different set of policy initiatives, certainly on the regulatory side. And that could initially be pretty bad for the stock market and the economy. However, the founders did come up with this amazing systems of checks and balances. So even if you had a radical left-wing kind of presidency, I think the checks and balance system would keep things kind of continuing to go fairly down the middle. So I'm not convinced that if Trump loses and a Democrat wins, it necessarily implies a bear market and a recession. But I think initially the market would not react well to the change.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Appreciate it. Moving on to the next story here. Oh, come on. Leave me alone already. Oh, come on. No. Hello. Okay. All right, S&P 500 earnings update. Q3 may not be the trough. S&P 500 earnings update. Q3 may not be the trough. Summary: 2019 and 2020 earnings expectations continue to decline as the S&P 500 hits a new all-time high. Will earnings growth trough in Q3 or Q4? Defense sectors historically perform well on a relative basis when earnings growth is declining. This idea was discussed in more depth with members of my private investing community. This is written by this is coming up by Eric Basmagin. S&P 500 earnings update. After concluding the busiest week of earnings season, with about 75% of S&P 500 companies reporting aggregate results show sales growth of 3.01% and earnings growth of negative 0.99%. At the start of earnings season a few weeks ago, estimates for Q3 earnings growth touched a low of negative 3.77%. I mentioned in the chat room of EPB Macro Research that I expected the final numbers to be roughly 0% to 1%, as companies typically beat a lowered bar. Earnings growth of negative 0.99% represents a sequential deceleration from the 2.26% growth in Q2. Okay, moving on from the story. Investors who bought. Okay, yeah. There's a lot of charts and graphs in here that won't translate very well and over the radio. So moving on, man. Investors who bought CVS Health, New York's shares 5 years ago are now down 24%. Coming at you from Yahoo Finance. Investors who bought CVS Health shares 5 years ago are now down 24%. While not a mind-blowing move, it is good to see that the CVS Health Corporation share price has gained 21% in the last 3 months, but over the last half decade, the stock has not performed well. In fact, the share price is down 24%, which falls well short of the return you could get by buying an index fund. To quote Buffett, ships will sail around the world, but the flat earth society will flourish. There will continue to be wide discrepancies between price and value in the marketplace. By comparing earnings per share, EPS, and share price changes over time, we can get a feel for how investor attitudes to a company have morphed over time. During the 5 years over which the share price declined, CVS's health earnings per share, EPS, dropped by 2.4% each year. Readers should note that the share price has fallen faster than the EPS at a rate of 5.3% per year over the period. This implies that the market was previously too optimistic about the stock. You can't see below. All right, you can see below. All right, no, you can't. All right, so we consider it positive that insiders have made significant purchases in the last year. Having said that, most people consider earnings and revenue growth to be a more meaningful guide to the business. What about dividends? When looking at investment returns, it is important to consider the difference between total shareholder return, TSR, and share price return. The TSR is a return calculation that accounts for the value of cash dividends, assuming that any dividend received was reinvested, and the calculated value of any discounted capital raisings and spinoffs. So for companies that pay a generous dividend, the TSR is often a lot higher than the share price return. In the case of CVS Health, it has a TSR of a negative 14% for the last 5 years. That exceeds its share price return that we previously mentioned. And there's no prize for guessing that the dividend payments largely explain the divergence. A different perspective. While the broader market gained around 14% in the last year, CVS Health shareholders lost 4.9%, even including dividends. Even the share prices of good stocks drop sometimes. But we want to see improvements in the fundamental metrics of a business before getting too interested. Regrettably, last year's performance caps off a bad run, with the shareholders facing a total loss of 3% per year over 5 years. We realize that Buffett has said investors should buy when there's blood on the streets, but we caution that investors should first be sure that they are buying high-quality businesses. Investors who like to make money usually check up on insider purchases, such as the price paid and total amount bought. Okay, so moving on. Moving on. Wall Street's leading stocks reveal investor caution. Good. It's always good to be cautious. By April Joyner. Coming at you from Yahoo Finance. New York, Reuters. All right, Wall Street stocks have climbed to record highs as worries over U.S.-China trade relations and the Federal Reserve's monetary policy have receded. But cautious investors have been sticking with technology shares and some defensive stocks over value stocks and more speculative plays such as IPOs. That's unlikely to change in the near term, even if stocks keep rising, strategists say, as uncertain economic conditions lead investors to shares of companies with solid earnings and growth prospects. As concerns over a slowdown in global economic growth have loomed, technology shares and defensive shares in the real estate, utilities, and consumer staples sectors have alienated in leading U.S. stocks higher. Technology companies are considered capable of earnings growth even if the economy falls into a recession, while defensive shares offer steady dividends. The S&P 500 has gained 22% this year, in large part because of the 36% gain in technology shares, which have an outsized impact on the benchmark index. The S&P 500 tech sector includes the two largest U.S. companies by market capitalization, Apple Inc. and Microsoft Corporation. Apple shares have surged 62% year to date, Microsoft 41%. Overall, tech stocks account for roughly a third of the benchmark index's gains. Real estate shares have risen 26%, the second largest percentage gain among S&P sectors, but they have a minuscule weighting on the index. Shares of less fundamentally sound companies, by contrast, have faltered. The small cap Russell 2000 index, a third of whose consultants have no net income, has underperformed the S&P 500 in 2019. And shares of several companies that have gone public this year have fallen sharply since their debuts, including Lyft Inc., Uber Technologies Inc., and Slack Technologies Inc. Unprofitable U.S. companies holding IPOs this year have had a median stock return of 0%, according to Reuters analysis. Investors are not just going to buy anything indiscriminately, said David Joy, chief market strategist at Ameriprise in Boston. We want to see some earnings or some prospects for earnings. All right, end of the big show, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you all for tuning in. Have a great day, a great night, rather. Stay out of trouble. Don't take any wooden nickels. Don't do anything I wouldn't do.